organized by the All Institute of Medical Sciences and by uh, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, where we are trying to really set up regional and state centers of excellence through interactive webinar seminars. And you've been already there for the last four webinars that we've had. The current webinar, which we're discussing, is something which may be a little bit high end, and we need to really be able to see how, at a primary health level, we can provide some degree of support, but it may not be ideal in terms of ventilation and ICU management as far as COVID 19 is concerned. We've learned a lot, and as far as management is concerned, although the ventilatory management has been almost the same as per the ARDS protocol. We've come a long way as far as the ARDS protocol is concerned. I remember as a resident that reading an article by Tuxen and Lane way back in the late 80s, where they put patients of asthma who were having a very high respiratory rate onto a ventilator and followed the concept of permissive hypercapnia. So you had a person who was breathing very rapidly, an asthmatic whom you would actually expect to wash out carbon dioxide. And in such a patient, they actually used low tidal volume, allowed the PCO2 to rise, allowed the pH2 to come down, and were able to show that barotrauma and other things were less, and the survival was much better. And subsequently, we had the whole concept of low tidal volume permissive hypercapnia as a standard of care for ARDS as far as management of these patients are concerned. The same strategy, more or less, is what is followed as far as the ventilatory strategy for COVID 19 with acute lung injury is concerned. It's a viral pneumonia which causes acute lung injury. It causes more than just that, because it also causes a hypercoagulable state. There's a lot of VQ mismatch which happens, as we see in many of our patients. And obviously, there are other issues in terms of high dose steroids being given, patients getting tocilizumab, and therefore the chance of opportunistic infection, which could be bacterial or fungal. So critical care specialists who are working in the ICU have a tough job on their hand managing sick patients with ARDS, getting many of them getting high dose steroids, and the fear of opportunistic infection is always there. Along with that, of course, the other trials, as far as fluid management was concerned, showed that conservative fluid management is much better than liberal fluid management, fluid infusion in ARDS. So, a lot of learnings that we've had from the ARDS network trial. A lot of basics things I'm sure will be discussed today to present the topic and to give a talk on this topic. We have a faculty, Dr. Kapil Dev Soni, who is a critical care specialist, and he'll be talking on ventilation and ICU management. And among the panelists, we have Professor Anjan Trikha and, of course, Dr. Neeraj Nishchal and myself, and we'll try and answer your questions at the end. So I'll ask Kapil to start with his presentation, and after that, we can have the questions as we do every time. So over to you, Dr. Kapil.
Thank you, sir. So, good evening, all. I'm Dr. Kapil Dev Soni, and I'm an additional professor of critical care at AIIMS New Delhi. What I would be discussing about is ventilation and ICU management of COVID patients. My talk is limited to the invasive ventilation, the intubation, when to do it, what are the strategies to follow, and what are the complications we see in our day-to-day management of COVID patients. So these are my disclosures. As if now there are none, conflict of interest, none. So the foremost question one must ask is, when does a COVID-19 patient requires invasive ventilation? Well, we are all familiar with the different spectrum of the disease. There are mild patients, there are patients presenting in the moderate conditions, and then there are a group of or subsets of patients who present in a severe disease. A severe disease is basically a patient who is having a high respiratory rate, who is breathing at the rate of more than 30 per minute, whose saturation is less than 90% on room air, and he is desaturating. Along with that, then he may present with other organ dysfunctions such as ARDS, sepsis, septic shock, or other comorbidities. In severe COVID patients, most would have a dyspnea or a shortness of breath, and this will be the most common symptom of a severe disease. and that would often accompany it with hypoxemia. The foremost question is how to manage these severe COVID-19 patients. So most commonly, these are put on oxygen, some sort of an oxygen delivering device that include a non-rebreathing mask, that include a high flow nasal cannula, a non-invasive ventilation. However, at certain point of time in their disease trajectory or a disease course, a decision about giving them an invasive ventilation has to be made. Now, that's the most difficult decision. If you look at the spectrum of a disease or the disease natural course, most of the patients who develop severe disease, they would come up in the second week of the illness. And out of that, only 5% would land up in ICU with critical illness. And those 5% of patients may be in need of invasive ventilation in form of intubation and a mechanical ventilation support. So the important thing is, if you receive a patient who are severe disease, you need to monitor them very carefully, observe them with pulse oximeter and clinical course. Now, these severe COVID patients should be admitted in an intensive care unit. However, given the paucity of intensive care unit beds in most of the hospitals, these patients are also being managed in the wards. And sometimes it's difficult to monitor them very closely. However, all the efforts should be made to bring those patients or to triage these patients towards the intensive care unit, because the monitoring facilities and the advanced equipment are mostly available in the intensive care unit to provide them respiratory support. The question of intubation and mechanical ventilation, when to do it in a severe COVID patient, is a $1 million question. There is no clear-cut answers whether you should intubate them early or put them in invasive mechanical ventilation, or you should wait for the disease to progress and give them, or you intubate them at very late stages of the disease. It totally depends upon the course of the patient and the trajectory of the patient. There are certain risks associated with the invasive ventilation, but then there are certain benefits which are also associated with the invasive mechanical ventilation. So all the efforts should be made to avoid intubations, because in a pandemic, when your hospitals are actually overflowing with the severe disease patients, sometimes it's difficult to monitor invasive ventilation patients. So what you need to do is that patients should be given all other options that include the face mask, the high flow nasal cannula, the non-invasive ventilation with the helmet if possible, or a face mask. So all these therapies have actually shown in a meta-analysis that they prevent the need of intubation. The opportunities to provide them the high flow nasal cannula, the face mask, and the non-invasive ventilation does prevent the need for intubation and the invasive mechanical ventilation. And if it's possible, those should be used first before going for invasive mechanical ventilation. But then there are conditions which are very clear-cut answers or clear-cut indications to put a certain subset of patients on invasive mechanical ventilation. That includes if the patient presents with impending drowsiness or altered sensorium, or they present with impending airway obstruction or the threatened airway, or there's an increased signs of unsustainable work of breathing, or patients developing refractory hypoxemia, not responding to the other oxygen delivery devices. That means the non-rebreathing mask, the NIV, and the high flow nasal cannula, or the patient is developing life-threatening hypercapnia or acidemia, or there is an encephalopathy. So these are the clear-cut indications. But in a COVID-19 patient, sometimes you need to factor in other variables also to decide whether you should intubate the patient and you should put them on invasive mechanical ventilation. And one of the most important factors to decide them is the disease trajectory. Now that would vary in each and every patient subject. You need to monitor those patients and see how the patient is progressing. Is it improving? Is it deteriorating? Is it responding to the steroids and other therapies? Or there is a constant comorbidities which is progressing at a very fast pace. So that needs to be factored in when you are making a decision about when would you intubate these patients. But then there are other conditions. Sometimes intubating them early gives you a safe environment, whereas if you delay your decision too long and you need to intubate these patients once they crash, then sometimes it may be associated with adverse outcomes. So a conscious decision about when to intubate should be made. Important is, if you look at the timing of intubation and ventilative support, and this is the disease progression or a disease course, most of the intubation and ventilative support would be required in the second B of the pulmonary phase. Now, this is the phase where there is a shortness of breath, there is an increasing progressive hypoxia, there is abnormal chest imaging, there are other biomarkers which are getting deranged, and there is an increasing work of breathing which is happening. And all other oxygen delivery devices have failed or they are not being able to sustain the work of breathing. Then a conscious decision should be made about the timing of intubation and ventilative support before they land up into an overt organ failures. I give you an example. This is a routine example which we see in our day-to-day management of COVID-19 patients. A 51-year male who presented with a history of fever of 5 days and a shortness of breath for 2 days. On arrival to the ED, he is tachycardic. His saturation is 90% on a room air and is tachypneic with a breathing rate of 30 per minute. He is admitted to ICU for the close observation and monitoring. He is put on other oxygen support with a non-rebreathing mask of 10 liters per minute. On the second day of ICU, you see that ICU admission, you see that this breathing at the rate of 45 breaths per minute. You try non-invasive ventilation with a pressure support and a PEEP and a high FiO2. However, you see that he's not responding to NIV or he's non-compliant to NIV. And there is a progressive hypoxia, which could be a life-threatening. And it does not tolerate NIV or awake proning at all. So now this is the point of the disease trajectory when you must think about should you intubate the patient and put him on an invasive mechanical ventilation. Intubation mechanical ventilation is again, the moment you put the certain patients on intubate and put them on mechanical ventilation, the care or the amount of magnitude of care which patient would need would increase multifold. He would require a lot of nursing care. He would require a lot of ancillary cares as well. So a decision should be very conscious, should be discussed with the family members, and they should be informed that you are going to intubate and put the patient on a mechanical ventilation electively, seeing the course of the disease and the failure of the other modalities of the treatment. So when to switch from NIV to invasive mechanical ventilation? So if the patient is having an increasing drowsiness in spite of other oxygen delivery support therapy, patient is having a vomiting or there's an increased risk of aspiration, there is a progressing radiographic severity. You look at the X-rays, which is progressing the input rates are increasing at very rapid pace, or there is a falling respiratory system compliance. He is not able to breathe at all, or there is an increased need of PEEP on the non-invasive ventilation, or there is an increasing minute ventilation. All these are the indicators which would help you in decision making whether you should intubate the patient or switch over from NIV to invasive mechanical ventilation. So when to escalate, other thing is that the moment you put patients on oxygen therapy should be carefully monitored for the work of breathing, increasing oxygen requirement, and the hemodynamic stability. If the patient is developing hemodynamic instability, those are the candidates that should be actually intubated and put on mechanical ventilation. But then there are in COVID-19 patients, then you can also use other information in sort of biochemical indicators which would help you in determining whether you should go for intubation and mechanical ventilation. One is an advanced age. Most elderly, because they have very limited physiologic reserves, they may not be able to sustain the increased work of breathing, and they may crash very quickly, or they may progress to emergency intubation, or they may progress to a disease at a very fast rate. So these patients should be carefully observed and monitored, and should be intubated at an earliest. Patients with persistent high fever not responding to steroids and other treatments, they may require invasive mechanical ventilation, persistent neutrophilia, lymphocytopenia, elevated markers of other organ dysfunction such as hepatic and renal failure, rising urea, rising creatinine, or rising aminotransferases or alanine transferases, elevated markers of inflammation such as the CRP or IL-6 or procalcitonin and serum ferritin, increasing correlation dysfunctions related indicators such as fibrinogen, D-dimer, or prothrombin. All these factors, if taken into consideration together, they would help you in making decision whether you should intubate the patient or not. So these all indicators should be correlated very clinically with the patient condition, and a conscious decision should be made of invasive mechanical ventilation. Now, once you decide to put somebody on an invasive mechanical ventilation, one thing is to go for a endotracheal intubation. Now, intubating a COVID-19 patient is a high-risk procedure, both for the staff as well as for the patient. there is a risk of aerosol transmission, there is a risk of aerosol generation, and the infection of the healthcare staff. So all the precautions should be maintained that include consider all intubations as a high risk procedure. Full PPE with the face shield, goggles, and the hand hygiene should be maintained. Limit the personnel who are involved in the intubation procedure. Should be done with the most experienced of anesthetists available. Use CMAC or the other laryngoscopy techniques which prevent or limits the aerosol generation. Avoid back mask ventilation as much as possible. Do not intubate before complete neuromuscular blockade. Avoid disconnections the moment you intubate and connect to a ventilator. Do not ventilate before the cuff is insertion. So these are the strategies which one can use while performing endotracheal intubation. Now, once the endotracheal intubation has been performed, you need to initiate mechanical ventilation. The basic function of mechanical ventilation is that it improves the gas exchange function, specifically the oxygenation and carbon dioxide elimination, while it also reduces the work of breathing. So it gives you a lot of it gives the rest of the respiratory muscles and diverts all the blood flow towards the essential organs. Mechanical ventilation is basically a support device. It's not a therapy for the COVID-19 patient, but it does limit the work of breathing which the patient is doing, and it's sort of a supportive therapy, supportive treatment, while the underlying pathology resolves on its own. Now, what we have seen in COVID-19 patients is that the COVID-19 ARDS is not a different ARDS what we have been reading in the literature. The pathophysiology is almost similar. You will find diffuse infiltrates on the both sides of the lungs. On the autopsies, you can see the consolidations, which are a hallmark of ARDS. So the strategy of ventilator management is quite a similar strategy what we have been learning from our past experience of managing ARDS. So what the strategy should aim at limiting the alveolar overdistension, hyperoxia, and the cyclical alveolar collapse. Now, these are the three basic fundamental principles on which a ventilator strategy or of the patient manages. Most mechanical ventilation would have multiple modes available. There could be a volume support mode, or there could be a pressure support mode, a volume control, or a pressure control mode. And then there are other combination modes which are available on most machines of mechanical ventilation. However, as till date, no mode is superior to another mode. It totally depends upon the expertise and the training of the healthcare provider or that is comfortable with, and that can be selected based on the experience of the healthcare provider. However, if you just classify based on the mechanical ventilation modes, there are control modes, assisted mode, supported mode, and spontaneous mode. The moment the patient is intubated and put on mechanical ventilation, one should start with the assisted modes. And that is control mode. That is the full support of mechanical ventilation. And each day, with the improvement in the underlying disease pathology and the clinical condition, one should gradually wean off the ventilator from the full control mode towards the support and the spontaneous breathing mode. So this is a common strategy which we are all aware with. If you look at the lung protective ventilation, now we don't need to ventilate these patients with a very high tidal volume. What we need to do is that we should limit the tidal volume between 4 to 8 cc per kilogram of predicted body weight. We should reduce the PEEP. Most of what in our experience, what we have found that if we have been able to extubate these patients or wean off these patients, most would work with 8 to 10 centimeter of water of PEEP, and that would be useful in managing these patients. Avoid generation of high plateau pressures, specifically in patients with very fragile lungs and the old age patients with the limited lung reserves. So these patients have tendency to develop barotrauma and may develop further complications of mechanical ventilation. So a lung protective strategy which aims at reducing the tidal volume, limiting the plateau pressure to less than 30 centimeters of water, and constantly giving them assisted breath is a beneficial for COVID ARDS patients. However, if you are on the bench side of the patients and you see most patients would have different sort of a lung involvement, and sometimes you would need to tailor your ventilatory strategy based on the specific need of each patient. You can actually look into the X-rays. You can look at other parameters which would help you determine about the appropriate strategy, whether you go for volume control or a pressure control. Would you like to limit the plateau pressures, or would you like to uh, start with the spontaneous breathing? So it totally depends upon the underlying lung conditions, how much lung is involved, and for what purpose the ventilation was initiated. If the lung shows recovery, you should go down on a spontaneous ventilation as soon as possible, because keeping these patients on a steroid on a long and on a controlled mechanical ventilation long would hamper the early recovery and the weaning from the ventilation. Most patients for COVID-19 would require mechanical ventilation. If they are put on mechanical ventilation, they would require for at least for 1 to 3 weeks. And during these period of mechanical ventilation, they are prone to develop certain complications that include the ventilator-associated pneumonias and other ventilator-induced lung injuries. There are certain steps for novices, because certain times you may not have intensivists available all over the places of the hospital, and you need to initiate mechanical ventilation even in the wards. In certain situations, if you are novice, the certain things you can do, which is fundamentals, that include determine the oxygen which is required for the patient, set the FiO2, set the PEEP of the mechanical ventilator, decide the mode, initial mode and the weaning mode. It could be volume set or a pressure set. If you are unsure about lung compliance, or your monitoring is not that vigilant, then you can go for volume control mode, because that's one of the safe way to start assist control, or there's one of the safe way to start. However, if you are very vigilant and you are able to make a constant observations of the patient, then you can even choose other modes such as pressure control mode. You set the tidal volume between 4 to 8 cc per kilogram. Choose the respiratory rate, which is mostly would follow between 25 to 35 breaths per minute. Adjust the PEEP. That adjustment of PEEP, you can follow a table, that is the ARDS dot table, or you can start with the moderate amount of PEEP and then optimize based on the lung compliance. Clinically observe the rise of the chest. You can order for arterial blood gases following the intubations and initiation of mechanical ventilation, and then you can call for help. And that you can always call for specialists if you have initiated mechanical ventilation even in wards or remote settings. Now, just putting somebody on a mechanical ventilation is a double-edged sword. Not only it provides benefit, but then there are certain disadvantages. One of the disadvantages is that if the lung compliance is quite bad, patient may develop impaired venous return, and there could be hypotension and reduced cardiac output. What we have seen in our own experience, most patients, if they are intubated and they are not observed very closely, they tend to develop barotrauma. Now, the development of pneumothorax is quite frequent, and either this could be because of the ventilator-induced lung injury, or it could also be because of the underlying lung pathology of the COVID-19. And then there may be development of dead spaces in form of reduced gas exchange. So all these pitfalls and problems should be anticipated, specifically in a patients who have been intubated and put on mechanical ventilation. However, these patients, the moment you put and they are in severe COVID, if they have developed a severe ARDS, most of them would require a prone positioning. What we are following at our center is that the patients who are intubated and the PF ratio is less than 150, they are and in a prone position, and they're kept in a prone position from 16 to 18 hours. Definitely, once you turn up the patient, this would require an additional nursing support, that would require additional care, and not all centers would have facility to closely monitor these patients. Putting somebody on a relaxant and the steroids with a prone position would need to be monitored. These patients would need to be monitored for complications. And one of the most common complications what we have seen in our own experience is the development of hypotension. So these patients should have lines, that means the invasive lines, the arterial lines, and the central venous catheterization, and this should be followed. Now, putting somebody in a prone position not only improves the gas exchange, but it reduces the pressure from the dependent parts of the lungs, and it improves overall functional residual capacity. So it's sort of a recruitment maneuver. It also improves the cardiac output, because there is a cardiac independence between the lungs, and the heart-lung interactions becomes much better. Prone positioning provides a lot of improvement in the gas exchange. However, there would be certain subsets of patients who have predominantly involvement of in the ventral parts of the lungs, and those patients may not have any benefit from the rescue prone therapies. So those should be identified, and if the prone therapy is not being successful, then in those subsets of patients, then it may be continued to have other positioning such as lateral positionings or head elevated positioning. So these different positioning should be tried on the patients who have developed severe ARDS with caution. Now, once you put somebody on a ventilator, patients require a lot of supportive treatment. That includes a fresh ventilator circuit for every new patient. The circuit needs to be changed at very frequent intervals if they are visibly soiled. The use of two HME filters, one at the patient end and other at the expiratory end, to reduce the aerosol generation. Avoid frequent disconnections of circuit. Now, this is important because patients need the recruitment of the lung. The moment you disconnect the circuit from the ventilator, the whole advantage of recruitment is lost in a matter of few minutes. So it should be avoided. Disconnections should be avoided as much as possible. The use of close line insuction is advocated. Tracheostomy should be delayed by the end of the 2 weeks. Daily sedation vacation and assessment of consciousness should be done on each day. These patients are mostly put on empiric antibiotics. However, empiric antibiotics may be discontinued in absence of leukocytosis or other evidence of infection. And the routine culture sampling and the alveolar lavage should be done in case of suspected infection, and they should be sent for detection of organisms. Along with ventilator care, there needs to be maintained a proper hydration and nutrition. So therefore, a daily nutrition target should be set for each patient. Now, along with ventilator care, what we have seen COVID-19 patients is that they frequently develop cardiovascular impairment. Most patients would have arrhythmias or a myocarditis with heart failure or a venous and arterial thromboembolism, acute coronary syndrome, and shock. So these conditions should be managed with the proper diagnosis and the treatment. In such scenarios, the measurements of biomarkers such as D-dimer, IL-6, troponin, NT-proBNP, they do help in narrowing down the diagnosis and initiation of appropriate treatment. Now, if these patients, mechanical ventilated patients, do develop shock and the infection, the foremost important principle is to restore arterial pressure and to optimize cardiac output. In such scenarios, you may take help of advanced hemodynamic parameters and hemodynamic machines if they are available in your ICU, or you can go for just perfusion measurement of looking at the perfusion of these patients with the shock. Fluid strategy, as sir has elicited, that these patients, because they are developing ARDS, their lungs should be kept dry, and conservative fluid therapy or strategy should be followed. These patients tend to develop hypovolemia because of associated sepsis. It's just important to assess the benefit and the risk ratio of fluid administration. Here, each drop counts. If you overhydrate these patients, the whole advantage of lung recruitment and the improvement in the gas exchange is lost. So a fluid strategy should be very narrowly titrated with the blood pressure, hemodynamic instability, as well as with the need of the keeping the lungs dry. In such scenarios, fluid responsiveness tests do come handy, and you may just look at whether the patient is actually requires fluid or not, or giving fluid would benefit the patient or not. Advanced hemodynamic monitoring technology such as echo or stress, that would help in giving fluid challenge, would help in determining whether the patient is actually get benefit from fluid transport or not, fluid transfusion or not. If these patients do develop shock, norepinephrine is the first line vasopressor. Vasopressin could be added as a second vasoactive agent to reach the target blood pressure. And the most common target blood pressure in a patient who was a normotensive prior to the COVID-19 and development of shock is basically keeping the blood pressure 65 mmHg or more, mean arterial pressure. Though in certain patients who tend to develop acute heart failure or acute cor pulmonale because of COVID ARDS, dobutamine might help in improving cardiac performance in these patients. These patients also tend to develop renal impairment. If we look at the data, the AKI is present in almost 6.10% of patients of COVID-19. However, the mortality is disproportionately extremely high. That is to the tune of 91.7%. In a study where the authors found that the renal function admission where the serum urea and creatinine was elevated in the almost 13.1% of patients and 14.4% of patients. And these patients also who are developing AKI, they do tend to develop coagulation abnormalities. And along with that, the metabolic acidosis and hyperkalemia, which are the conventional complications of AKI, are quite evident in the patients of COVID-19 with mechanical ventilation. However, the indication for renal replacement therapy for AKI and critical ill patients are well established, whether COVID-19 status is regardless of that. So the initiation of renal replacement therapy remains the same. If they tend to develop AKI, that should be supported with the RRTs. What about glycemic control? These patients, because they are on steroids, the blood sugars tend to fluctuate a lot. So a close monitoring of blood sugars is warranted. Liberal indications for early use of intravenous insulin is advocated. What we have found that if you start using intravenous insulin quite early, along with the steroids and on patients on mechanical ventilation, there's a better control of sugars rather than using oral hypoglycemic agents. The target level between the critical ill patient blood glucose still remains between 140 to 180 milligram per deciliter. So along with that, these patients who are put on mechanical ventilation, they tend to develop other infections such as the ventilator-associated pneumonias and other complications that include myotrauma, volutrauma, or a ventilator-induced lung injuries. And that has to be taken care of. So in short, a severe COVID-19 disease requiring ventilation is actually a challenge. It requires a lot of manpower, close observation. However, given the scale or magnitude of patients coming to our center, the need for manpower is quite a challenge here. The use of strategy in managing such patients should be there in your institute. Remember, in these patients, doing less is more. Doing the things we do and doing them well is the mantra, and most patients will benefit if you stick to a conventional good critical care. Infiltrates alone are not the indication for mechanical ventilation. However, if you initiate too early or too late, both may be disastrous scenarios. And most importantly, you would need to follow your patient trajectory. You need to know where your patient is moving. Is he improving? Is he worsening? And then as a conscious decision, you need to initiate whether patient would benefit from a mechanical ventilation or not. Thank you. Thank you for patient listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kapil Soni, for an excellent presentation regarding the ventilation and ICU management. I think what we've learned is that the management is not that different from what we were doing in the past in terms of lung protective strategy. And the basic aim to prevent volutrauma, barotrauma, and biotrauma as far as the lung is concerned, so that we don't cause more harm than good. The challenge that we have, which I feel, is that we are now seeing such a surge in the number of cases that we are having people who are not critical care specialists being forced to manage patients who are actually having COVID-19 almost like a critical care specialist or in a semi ICU or HDU setting. And therefore, I personally feel that we should, as a group, try and develop some sort of a simple protocol that if you intubate, these are the three things that you need to do. Put the FiO2 at so much. What should be the predicted body weight? Based on that, put your tidal volume at so much. Look at the plateau pressure. Do this. What are the basic things that can be done so that some degree of management? I know it's not going to be something which can be done because each patient has its own problems. But we need to look at how can we really help in terms of centers where you don't have critical care specialists, but now they're being pushed to manage patients who are actually having ARDS and are suddenly deteriorating, and they're intubating them and putting them on a ventilator. A lot of people I know who are not working in medical, let's say medicine, pulmonary medicine or critical care, but are in other specialties, have now become specialists as far as some parts of critical care are concerned. There are specialists, there are people who are ophthalmologists, but come and tell me that now they've become experts in interpreting ABGs. Similarly, we have other people who have really learned how to manage many respiratory issues as far as COVID is concerned, which is not part of this specialty. So this is going to be another challenge that we have as far as ventilatory and ICU management is concerned. we don't have enough critical care specialists in the country to really say that you will get managed only by critical care specialists. At the same time, we need to develop strategies where we can provide care which is simple but can be done by people who are internists, physicians, but may not be critical care specialists. So let's think of that and see how we can go ahead. Maybe one could make a simple flow diagram, do this, and monitor this. And if that is not there, and we could use things like teleconsultation, telemedicine to guide people of how they can go how about managing these patients. If they just send us, let's say, a video or a picture of the monitor or the ventilator or what is happening to the patient, and that can be done. So I think we need to really think a little bit out of the box as far as ventilatory strategies are concerned, starting with some sort of an SOP, and then guiding people in smaller towns as far as this is concerned. Before I pass it on to Rajiv to take the questions, I'll ask Dr. Anjan Trikha if he has anything to say as far as the talk is concerned, and then we will have the question answer. I'll try and answer them. Anjan, Kapil, and Neeraj, all of us will try and answer your questions. So over to Anjan.
Thank you, sir. I think you've rightly mentioned that in this last 14 months, we've seen a lot of people who are from varying specialties who are managing patients to the best of their capabilities. The only thing I would like to add here is that if there are people who have not really dealt with ventilators or sick patients or something of that kind, one thing which has been told by Dr. Guleria rightly is that you could have a video conferencing with anybody of us, and a lot of people are here on the panel who could do that. Alternately, if you could just come across an anesthesia person who's even a diploma holder, and he just closes his eyes and imagines that this patient is undergoing a surgery for about 24 hours, and what all he has got to do it. At least he can tide over the crisis till more help can be achieved. It basically boils down to a periphery setup where somehow a ventilator has reached and there has been some oxygen, and they're waiting for about 24 to 48 hours so that help could come or the patient could be shifted. So these are the kind of anesthesia chaps who could give you some help on that account. Alternately, there is enough of material on the YouTube if you have good connections there, how to set it up. And I hope in the near future we could have a simple flow chart like Sir has said that, well, weight is this, tidal volume this is going to be the lung protective ventilation strategy. And we must get used to working in low resource areas. Managing these things in tertiary care centers would be very easy, but doing it in low resource areas would be really very difficult. But I'm sure we can live up to the challenge and we can help our colleagues anywhere in the country. Over to Rajiv.
Thank you. Over to Rajiv.
Thank you, sir. We seem to have moved on to a part. We seem to have moved on to a part of the webinars where we are now getting more of core issues being discussed, and therefore the questions on general topics will tend to decrease. That's what we see on the chat box and in the Q&A. Is there anybody on the panel who would like to make any initial comments before we move on to the Q&A on general ventilatory management, or should we just proceed to the Q&A then?
So any one of the mentoring institutes, if they would like to really say something or really share their experience, if I may put it that way, we can have their comments also before we take the questions. I think we have AFMC, if I'm not mistaken.
Colonel Kiran.
A lot of patients are not doing too well once they go on mechanical ventilation. I feel a part reason for this is not just the mechanical ventilation. When you're initiating the mechanical ventilation, the patient is already very severe and he's gone into the cytokine storm. This is already a multi-organ dysfunction process. So it's affecting the kidney, it's affecting more coagulopathy, things like that. So it's the overall picture that is leading to a poor outcome than just the mechanical ventilation. So we should go ahead and initiate mechanical ventilation based on the merit of mechanical ventilation. And there is cytokine storm and multi-organ dysfunction. The outcomes are going to be poor, we know that.
Right. So somehow the questions also begin with the issue of mortality and sick patients that you have. And therefore the first question is, what is the recovery rate in patients who reach ventilatory support? So
maybe Anjan can answer that. What is our experience?
Okay.
And maybe anyone from the group, they want to give their experience.
Like we all know, and we have earlier on in the after the first stage we had presented our data. So we all know that out of 100 patients, if they have COVID, about 15% would need hospitalization and about less than 5% would land up into ventilators. So what we had analyzed was that we had a survival rate of about 22% on patients who had been ventilated for various reasons, and I'm only talking about invasive ventilation. And these would be the patients who would have graduated, as Kapil has rightly told you, from simple oxygen to NIVs to HFNICs and then on ventilation. What is important here is that the cohort which we talk about is so varied. You could have a patient who's had a renal transplant and then he lands up on a ventilator who's immunosuppressed. You could have a patient with chronic liver disease, ascites, waiting for a liver transplant, he lands up into ventilator. And then you could have a patient who is basically a case of CA gallbladder who was walking to the hospital coming for chemotherapy and lands up. So once when you need to analyze what kind of group you talk about survival rate after intubations, because there will be a sicker group which will be very bad. But in totality, this is what we had found out after the first surge, and now we'll have our data for the second surge also. What I would like to put across here is it is not only intubation and ventilation that is going to matter. It is the whole system which is going to matter. It is your nursing care which is going to matter. If you don't have nursing care, you don't have residents who have managed patients on ventilators, then it's all going to be, your numbers are going to be very bad. As such, we knew earlier on in the disease that, and we were trying to avoid intubating patients because of the data coming from the West, that anybody who would be on a ventilator, we're going to lose. We are now slightly more confident. It's basically treating ARDS and putting COVID-19 into it. If you have a good team, your results can be excellent.
Right, sir. And continuing with the issue of ventilation and these managing with these patients, the next question therefore is that, do our intubation strategies, that is threshold for intubating a patient, should it be different in patients from the other types of ARDS, or is it common for COVID and any other kind of ARDS?
So I think it's pretty common. Kapil could address that, but he has already addressed that in his presentation.
So the strategy remains the same. That is the lung protective strategy. There is no separate strategy in a COVID-19 ARDS. So what our literature and data clearly suggests that the pathophysiology is almost the same. It's just the disease course and the disease trajectory which matters. However, the ARDS pathophysiologically is almost similar. So you need to give them the same lung protective strategy using the low tidal volume ventilation and the PEEP which is appropriate for the oxygen requirement.
And again, sorry.
So if I just may add, I would just say the same thing. Only thing to remember is that in COVID has a little bit of a hypercoagulable state also. So you must have a low threshold for thromboembolic phenomena, and also keep, if possible, do your ultrasounds regularly to look at the IVC and the right side of the heart, because sometimes deterioration may be because of that, which you may otherwise not have picked up. So just remember that COVID does cause a lot of systemic manifestation. Many pneumonias and ARDS don't do that. This virus has other manifestations. So just keep that in mind when we are managing these patients.
So, sir, continuing with your point about hypercoagulability, another question is the value of D-dimer in COVID patients in the ICU. Should it be done? How frequently should it be done?
So maybe Neeraj can start, and then Anjan can also take that up.
The D-dimer value in ventilated patients who are requiring can be monitored, but that should not be the sole criteria of deciding about anticoagulation. So most of these patients will require prophylactic dosing of anticoagulation, and those in which we already have a high risk of this thing, and we have evidence that this patient might be throwing embolus somewhere, then those patients can benefit from therapeutic dose of anticoagulation. As it's very clear that these patients may not be fit enough to be shifted for CTP and all. So D-dimer can guide us, but that should not be as a sole criteria of deciding what type of, at what dose anticoagulation should be used. And of course, Dr. Kapil and Dr. Anjan will add to that based on their ICU experience.
Yeah, I think Neeraj, you said it very well. D-dimer is is just an investigation which is going to tell us which way we are going. By the time a COVID-19 patient lands up on a invasive ventilation, he is already in a severe category. And as a thumb rule, he would be on some amount of heparin, whichever people could have. It could be simple non-fractionated heparin also if low molecular weight ones are not available. So at our place, they would invariably be, a large number of them will be on a BD dose of any one of those, Klexin or Fragmin, whatever you have. So D-dimers would just tell us whether we are in the right way. And Neeraj has rightly said that most of the times, or quite a large number of times, these patients would be sick enough so they can't be moved for a CT angio to look at what is happening. So D-dimers just give you an indication. We know that most of them will be on Klexin or heparin, and that's the way we have to go. You could decide on a patient who's not on a ventilator, or maybe he's one of those borderline cases, whether you want to give an OD dose or a BT dose, or if a patient, let's say, who already has a history of some kind of thromboembolic phenomena, then you could have a D-dimer, and then you could regulate your doses of your Klexin or Fragmin.
So I'd just like to add, one thing we must remember, biomarkers are non-specific. D-dimer actually was used for its negative predictive value rather than its positive predictive value, because we knew that D-dimer would be elevated even in a pneumonia, or any inflammation would cause high D-dimer. So if you had a strong suspicion of pulmonary thromboembolism, a low D-dimer or a negative D-dimer ruled out thromboembolic phenomena. A high D-dimer did not establish pulmonary thromboembolism. And in a person who has ARDS, has extensive lung pneumonia, you will expect the D-dimer to be high. So I think you must look at your biomarkers along with clinical profile, and also at times look at them in a serial manner. How are they behaving, and then take a decision. But just to rely only on biomarkers and treat the patient, I don't think would be correct as far as management is concerned, whether it's in the ICU or even in patients with mild to moderate disease who are not in the ICU.
Again, continuing, sir, on the D-dimer and the anticoagulation, a couple of questions there. The first one is that would starting it early help prevent the need for support? And on the other hand, if you've started low molecular weight heparins, how long should you be giving it in the ICU? So does starting it early have any impact on the outcomes about the need for ventilation? And number two, once you've started it in the ICU, when do you stop it, or what do you do with it?
So Kapil, would you like to answer that?
So as far as severe disease is concerned, as Dr. Anjan clearly said, that most patients would already be on some sort of anticoagulation. What we do here is that once we start invasive ventilation, we put them on at least an intermediate dose, if not the full dose of anticoagulation. And we keep them serially monitored with repeated ultrasounds of the limbs, and to rule out formation of DVTs and other evidence of pulmonary embolism also. Till how long to continue it? What we do is that till the time the patient is in ICU, we continue with the intermediate dosing, and once we start weaning him off or show some improvement, we start reducing our dosing of low megawatt heparin to, say, a prophylactic dose. And if he is extubated and is fit to go to the ward, we send those patients on a prophylactic dosing of low megawatt heparin to the ward. And from that, once they get discharged, then they can be, then they don't need it to continue further at home. They don't need low megawatt heparins to be continued at home.
Can I add something, Rajiv, here?
Sure.
Okay, I think the question was, one of the things which the person wanted to know was that if a patient is put on low molecular weight heparin, will it prevent intubation or mechanical ventilation? Well, that's not the case. There is no association between the initiating of a low molecular heparin or a non-fractionated heparin and whether a patient would need ventilation or not. This is a totally different thing. We know that we have been seeing in these group of patients both kind of problems. We could see thrombogenic phenomena. We've also seen intracerebral bleeds also. So one has to really have a low threshold of changing your treatment plans, and like Kapil said, do an ultrasound every day or every alternate day to look for DVTs, and then take care of whether you need low molecular heparin or not. As a principle, we have not discharged I think any of the patients on oral anticoagulants after they have left our hospital, unless they required an oral anticoagulant for some basic other disease. Let's say a patient had a mitral valve replacement. He came to us with COVID, came out of it, and now when he was going back again, he shifted back to warfarin sodium, and then he's discharged. We per se as a protocol do not discharge these patients on any antiplatelets, anticoagulants, or even aspirin as a rule once they are discharged from our hospital.
If I may just add to that.
Sorry. Yes, sir.
One is that if you look at the guidelines, all the international guidelines actually recommend intermediate dose anticoagulants rather than full therapeutic dose anticoagulants as far as ICU care is concerned. And we should be careful. We've lost a few patients who, while being on anticoagulants, had extensive bleed, intracerebral bleed, and could have been part of the anticoagulants that we get, part of the disease process. But we have to remember that this is a double-edged sword, so we need to be careful one way or the other. Second is the issue of discharging patients and what should we do? There is a lot of, I think, there is no clear-cut, let's say, acceptance in the literature as to what we should do. As was mentioned by Anjan, for us, we really feel that our ethnic population is not that much prone to thrombosis and thromboembolic phenomena, and we have a low threshold of putting people on Novax or other anticoagulants when we send them. But there are people who would look at D-dimer value at the time of discharge, would also look at a severity score to see what is the chance of this person developing thromboembolism later on because of comorbidities like obesity or immobility or being in bed for a long time. And based on that, may sometimes take a decision to continue or start anticoagulants, oral anticoagulants for a few weeks. So this is something which is debatable. I want Neeraj, if he has any comments to give on this, and then maybe people in the group what their experience has been.
Yes, sir. So again, this practice of discharging patient on anticoagulant should be discouraged because most of the time they land up with streaky hemoptysis, which actually complicates situation. So unless clearly indicated patient is on oxygen, I think initiation of anticoagulant should be not done, especially based on just D-dimer reports. That's something which we are seeing quite often.
So we have got some experience with discharging these patients on anticoagulation. So during the first wave, we found that there were few patients who died suddenly at home, and that was within the first 1 or 2 weeks after discharge. So these were the patients who were in ICU, who were either on invasive ventilator or non-invasive ventilator, and they had not achieved complete ambulation and mobility post-discharge. As these patients were frail and also they remained bedbound after discharge, so we thought that probably there's a need and we might be missing it in some patients. So thereafter, we started individualizing anticoagulation in these patients, and patients who have been on NIV or ventilator, if they are being discharged because of frailty, deconditioning, their ambulation takes time. And moreover, after going home also, they remained isolated for a while. So, and this disease as such, as you mentioned, is prothrombotic. So one has to individualize in patients who are obese, who are on oxygen, who have had a critical disease, who have got comorbidities. It would be worthwhile sending these patients on low dose anticoagulation. So I'm not talking about therapeutic anticoagulation, but a lower dose of NOACs like 10 milligram of rivaroxaban should be given to these patients to prevent these sudden deaths.
Yes, ma'am.
So yes, sir. In such patients, how long should we give these oral anticoagulants? How long, and what is the protocol for giving this low dose anticoagulants?
The Anti-Thrombosis Society has recommended 4 weeks of anticoagulation in these patients who've got comorbidities and were critically ill in a low dose, like 10 milligram of rivaroxaban or 2.5 milligram BD of apixaban for up to 4 weeks post-discharge.
Okay, so I'm going to club 3 questions here, and they specifically relate to management within the ICU. So how do you determine how much fluid is to be given, whether antifungals are to be given, and how do you maintain nutrition among your patients? So it's very specific for mechanically ventilated patients. Fluids, nutrition, and antifungals.
Anjan, would you like to address this?
You're still mute, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's coming to the first thing, fluids. I think Kapil has taken it up very well, and now we all know it is the thumb rule is to let's keep the patient dry. So we tend to keep our patients dry comparatively. So if you have a protocol of your ICU that you give, let's say 2 ml per kg per hour of fluids, so you will have to maintain that, and then you regulate it as per the condition of the patient. All said and done, keeping them dry would help you out with so many cases. Will help you out in weaning off these patients. It's not uncommon that we got to use some low dose fusamides or fusamide infusions if a patient is not doing well, hemodynamically unstable. So fluids will have to vary from patient to patient with a thumb rule that if you can keep them dry, you'll be better off. Next, we come to antifungals. I think antifungals have been used quite a lot in this pandemic, and as per se also we were using a lot of antifungals in India as a whole. We've had our share of mucor infection in the last surge. We're using a lot of steroids. A lot of patients have diabetes. So we don't use them at time zero as a protocol. They are not started at time zero. But if let's say we are trying to think, or we are thinking of using TOSI in patients, we would want a diabetic patients who has sugars which are giving us swings. And we going to use TOSI, we escalate our antibiotics. We also think about using a empiric antifungal. At the same time, using of antifungals in a normal ICU or an IRDS, a fresh shadow on the X-ray chest, patient deteriorating without any obvious cause of bacterial infection, those all things will hold good here also. But a rule which we generally try to follow is that if a patient is starting on TOSI, we have a low threshold of starting empirical antifungals. At times, this is not supported from the literature which comes from the West, but I have my own reasons for following what we do is because we accept as a rule that our nursing care is not as optimal as it is in most of the Western countries, where still in a pandemic also they try to maintain 1:1 nurse-patient ratio and infection practices which are still stringent. Coming to the third thing is nutrition. See, it comes back to the same thing. As early as possible, you try to start enteral nutrition, avoid parenteral nutrition, put in an NG tube. If you can't put in an NG tube, try an nasogastric tube if a patient is on a ventilator and you have some problems with the nostrils. So the earlier you try enteral nutrition, better we are going to be, and better all of us are going to be. And like we know that parenteral nutrition has its own problems. Kapil, would you want to add anything to that?
The only thing is that because what we have seen, our patients developing a lot of cachexia and loss of muscle mass when they stay on the mechanical ventilation for a few weeks. We have tendency to give them high protein diets, and that's what we insist them. Even the dietitians are involved in the planning of the nutrition, and that's the strategy we follow of high protein diets and keeping at least giving them 1400 to 1500 calories a day.
Rajiv, can I add one last thing?
Sure.
We are lucky enough to have a very robust dietetics department and a dietitian who's very much involved in this pandemic. So during their rounds, they nearly we have told them, and they are very good at it, to calculate the calories and the protein amount and the carbohydrate per amount for all mechanically ventilated patients at least, because the rest of them are taking orally and they can really take in a lot of other things. So those people help us a lot. And we know that steroids given over a long time will cause their own share of myopathies, and patients will have a lot of problems. And one more thing which we see is there's so much of catabolism that the patients lose weight very fast. It's so very difficult for a patient to even walk out of the ICU after, let's say, 10 days if they go back in ambulances. So nutrition becomes very important in the totality of invasive ventilation.
Right, sir. Again, continuing only on ventilation, again, I'd like to reiterate, I'm specifically cherry picking questions which are more pertinent to the topic today rather than taking all the questions in sequence. So the next question that again continues on ventilation is, when would you consider doing a tracheostomy, or do you have a weaning protocol in particular for these patients?
Kapil?
Yeah, so the first question is about the weaning protocol. What we follow is a daily sedation vacation, and we assess the patient taking into consideration the underlying lung condition and the improvement overall. we give them the spontaneous breathing trials and the start from the half an hour to 2 hours and see how the patient performs over the spontaneous breathing trials. Once we are satisfied that the patient is conscious, he would be able to maintain his airway and his work of breathing is acceptable. There is no high requirement of minute ventilation. And then we take a decision whether to extubate the patient or not. So that's how we start weaning trials based on daily sedation vacation and the gradual lowering of ventilative support. But all this, we must factor in the disease progress and the disease improvement. If the underlying lung condition should be improved before embarking on the weaning trials. As far as tracheostomy is concerned, what we have experienced is that we try to delay tracheostomy at least 2 weeks. We don't do it before 2 weeks. Most patients who undergo tracheostomy, they are undergone between 2 to 3 weeks. And where we realize that patient would have a prolonged weaning and it would be difficult to wean from the ventilator because of the associated comorbidities or because of associated critical illness, myopathy. So these patients will end up on tracheostomy. But we do consciously, we do between second to third week of illness.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay, I think he's rightly pointed out everything. Weaning would be as per standard protocols which are followed in your ICUs. We shouldn't change them, but the only problem here are twofold. One is that the number of patients are so many, and the other is that there is a loss of healthcare worker manpower which is available. So one will need to tweak your own weaning protocols, which are essentially the same, to the best of your place where you are working, logistical issues. The second thing which is rightly been pointed out is about trachees. What we did during the earlier part, there was so much of fear about aerosols. We decided as a rule, we will not do our trachees in the ICU, we will not do any PCTs. So we did all our tracheostomies in the OTs. There was an additional problem of fogging in front of the goggles, and there were so we were very comfortable in doing our trachees in the OT with the ENT surgeon around and a cautery machine being around. Over the months, we have slightly graduated. Even we've done two percutaneous tracheostomies today. So now we are very comfortable in doing them in our own ICU setups. However, we always insist that there should be an extra pair of hand available in the operation in the ICU once we are doing it, because still doing these trachees in a COVID kind of an ICU, which is a makeshift ICU. We have a makeshift ICU. At least out of 3 of us ICUs are makeshift ICUs. So an extra pair of hand does wonders, and we follow what Kapil has said. Wait for 2 to 3 weeks. The only exception is that if you have an obese patient, truncal obesity, a person who wasn't able to lie prone, he lands up into intubation, and then you planning a tracheostomy. It's always worthwhile to do it early than to do it delayed.
So if I may just add one thing before we ask people in the group to give their comments. I think again the protocol for doing weaning is the same as it would have been for standard ARDS, and it's worthwhile that again when we're making some sort of an SOP, one can make a simple weaning protocol of how to do it, what to monitor, and when you can consider extubation and things like that. Because again, it'll be easier for us to talk about this at a tertiary care center. But if you're going to expect this to happen at a district hospital or at a center where, like Anjan said, a makeshift ICU is curated, keep that in mind, and maybe it's worthwhile for us as a group or regional centers to develop what is practical in terms of a weaning protocol in their setup. Because again, it's not very difficult, but you just have to put all the parameters that have to be looked at to say that the person is fit for a weaning trial, and then what are you going to look at to say that the person can now be extubated. Over to the
yes, sir. Kanukiran. You need to unmute yourself. You're still mute.
Regarding daily sedation vacation, probably you got to delay it a little bit more than other patients because the work of breathing has to settle and the hypoxemia has to improve. So that will probably take some time if you place the patient on ventilator, maybe a week or so. That's when you can start. And regarding tracheostomy, we were sort of by the end of first week, we generally plan our tracheostomies, do it in the OT. Maybe it'll help us do the tracheal toileting or handle the tube better. That was probably our only concern for that. And there have been some cases where we have extubated to NIV slightly earlier than you would extubate other patients. So I really don't know regarding that. We have had a lot of re-intubations having done that, but that's one strategy that we did follow, extubate to NIV slightly early.
Thank you.
So I'm now putting up a question again. I understand very little of what I'm asking you, so I'll just read it out as it is. It says a peak plateau of more than 30, tidal volume of 4 ml per kg, the PEEP that is lowest required to keep the pressure at an adequate of PaO2. What next? What next, I'm assuming, means that the patient still isn't able to maintain saturation despite these settings. So what next?
Okay, Kapil, what would you do now in such a situation?
So I would prone the patient, and proning itself is basically a recruitment maneuver. And then I would target the driving pressures. Sometimes you need to look into the consideration of the other compliance, whether the patient is obese, what about the chest condition, is it the compliance which is because of the chest, which is stiff. So that factor needs to be taken care of. But however, proning does help in recruitment of the lung and would improve the pressures as well.
Right.
If you were not able to prone the patient, then what would you consider doing?
So I would target the driving pressures, and we actually at our center, we liberally use the neuromuscular blockers and the deep sedations as well. If that's a compliance issue, definitely these patients would need some sort of a neuromuscular blocker, paralyzing agents, and they need to be kept sedated and paralyzed for at least 24 to 48 hours.
Okay. Anjan, you want to say something?
Yes. I think this is a very classical picture, and the person who's asked this question must have really pulled the hair apart, because we often come across this kind of a scenario. The problem here is that your plateau pressures are rising. You are not able to ventilate a patient. You're doing lung protective ventilation. The only option left to you is what Kapil has said: paralyze the patient, sedate him. Maybe first sedate him and then paralyze him. And then again, maybe decrease your tidal volumes a bit, increase your rates a bit. You've got to play around with your ventilator and see the ETCO2 is okay, and then you've got to go ahead and proceed. Proning is out, as sir would have said. So if you are not proning, and maybe it's a very right thing not to prone unless you are used to proning a patient. It's not easy managing a patient in the prone position. That's honest. And Dr. Guleria has correctly said that there will be instances in places where proning will not be possible. Then what to do? And then the only issue is this: paralyze, target your driving pressures, see what best ETCO2 can be maintained. And this is where permissive hypercapnia comes into play. So if you manage that well, and you hope the inflammation can be decreased by high dose steroids or whatever you plan to give as part of COVID, I think we can get away with it.
So I'll again lead on from the same question on another one that's on the box, and that's about what is the standard drugs for sedation? What are you using for sedation on a mechanically ventilated patient?
Kapil, you can answer that.
So what we use is liberal opioids. We use short-acting opioids like fentanyl, and if it's not available, then we go for morphine. However, we do use benzodiazepines like midazolam as well. In certain patients where we are attempting weaning, we have used propofol as well as dexmedetomidine, but those are very specific subsets of patients. Most commonly, we use fentanyl and midazolam.
Okay. So a little off track a little bit, but I thought Niran might want to come into something here. Are you seeing a lot of mucormycosis now? Because that's become a common issue that's being raised. So a couple of questions here on increasing fungal infections or mucor.
I think this is a very important issue, because it is something which is becoming a cause of concern. There are certain hospitals which have wards which are known as fungal wards, COVID fungal wards, because large number of patients there have fungal infection and they are struggling to manage them. So I'll ask Neeraj for his comments, Anjan, and then people from the group.
So this is something which we have been listening, but fortunately we have not been seeing such patients under us. Of course, those patients who had fungal infection and developed COVID are being admitted on and off from ENT department. But the number of patients who had been on steroid and then developed fungal infection is something which we are not seeing that much. Maybe it's just a bias. But theoretical possibility, especially in those patients who are diabetic or other are on other immunosuppression who have been given high dose of steroid, it's a theoretical possibility. But this WhatsApp message which has been circulating that this fungus is entering through the oxygen port in ventilated patients, that is something which I don't think is correct, and that rumor should be quashed right at the start, because most of these patients have filters and other things which prevent any this sort of infection entering into them. So in some part of the country, maybe just because the diabetics have not been able to take care of their diabetes status, and to add to that, they have been given steroid, may have led to increase in fungal infection. But just because a COVID patient has received steroid will develop fungal infection is something which I feel is a bit of exaggeration. But because of the other medical facilities suffering because of COVID, a number of cases might have increased actually.
What we have seen in the last 14 months or so is that we had one group of patients who came to us with some fungal masses who were being investigated, turned out positive, and were shifted to our COVID center, and finally a diagnosis of mucormycosis was made. They were supposed to undergo surgeries, but undergoing surgery, endoscopic surgery by the ENT surgeons was a bit of a problem in the earlier phase of the disease. We all know, like rightly said by Dr. Guleria, is that there are fungal wards of COVID in all over the world at this time. And about 6 months ago, from one of the corporate hospitals in India, Gangaram Hospital, reported about 6 cases at the same time in one of their wards. We too are very careful about that. But our patients come with mucormycosis who turned positive, and they were awaiting surgery, or night before surgery when they were not doing well, they were shifted to us, and there was some kind of effect on the vision. They needed emergency surgery. This is one group. We must remember that diabetes, uncontrolled, steroids, a lot of construction going on in Delhi, all leads to fungal infections, and this could be a problem with us. After having said that, there is a WhatsApp thing doing the round where somebody is trying to pour in iodine in the noses, both the nostrils. Every day something comes up to prevent mucormycosis in the patients. I think one should try to avoid them. The people have to be told not to put all kinds of things in your nostrils to avoid fungal infections, even if you were asked to be taking steroids. And Kapil and Neeraj has rightly said, it is being exaggerated, and these kinds of things make sensational journalism, which people tend to follow a lot.
I agree with that. So, you know what, I feel that there is a lot of hype as far as fungal infection is concerned. It's not that it is not there. On Saturday, I had gone to NCI Jhajjar. We have more than 500 patients admitted there. I had taken a round there, and I remember seeing one patient who had lost his vision, a diabetic obese person with COVID-19, and his CT had classically shown a mass in the orbit area. He is undergoing surgery today because of suspected mucor with infiltration around the eye. But it's not as common as one would have thought it is. And this patient was not on a ventilator. He was having poorly controlled diabetes, has been given high dose steroids outside, and that was probably precipitated this. So I think it's very important for us to understand that tight sugar control, good sugar control, and along with that, being judicious in the use of steroids may also help as far as this is concerned. I'm also aware that a group from PGI Chandigarh led by Dr. Anulok, they have a fungal infection study forum, are trying to collate all the fungal infections that are happening due to COVID-19, especially mucor. So we may get some data as to how common or uncommon it is in our country. So any comments from people in the group as far as their experience is concerned?
We have 2 cases of mucormycosis in last week. One presented with almost 10 days of his illness, and he has a rhinocerebral. He has ophthalmoplegia, but we could not do his CT brain. And the second patient developed during after 5 days of his methylprednisone and the remdesivir only, and he was a non-diabetic also. So that is why I want to know how long the steroid should be used judiciously, and what is the minimum period after the person develops hypoxemia.
Okay, we'll take that question. But anyone else has any experience as far as mucor is concerned?
We are not seeing much of mucor in our part of the country. And in fact, we haven't seen even a single case of pulmonary mucormycosis. There may be 1 or 2 rhinocerebral which have come. Possibly these cases could also be related to the dose of steroids which is being given. So I'm aware that in Western India, at some of the places, the pulse steroids to the tune of 1 gram per day is being given in patients who are coming with ARDS. So possibly there may be a correlation with the pulsing of steroids rather than just use of low dose steroids, which would be 6 milligram of dexamethasone.
Correct. I would tend to agree with that.
Sir, I am working in a good afternoon, sir. Sir, we have a 500 bedded COVID hospital right now. In our hospital, as of today, we have 4 mucormycosis patients. All had orbital and rhino nasal involvement. One of these patients had loss of vision also, as you said in your experience also. But since we have treated more than, I will say, 2,000 patients in last 1 month, and we had seen only 4 to 5 cases. So we are bound to see more and more mucormycosis patients because these patients were already on uncontrolled diabetes. And since the cases of COVID will increase, so there is bound to be more cases of mucormycosis. In last wave, we had lesser patients, so lesser number of mucormycosis patients were there in our experience.
Right. So the summary that seems to be is that, of course, it does exist, but the reports are far higher than what is generally the experience across the country from people at various institutions. Don't see as high as it's being made out to be. Okay, so the next question is on weaning again, and this says that does the use of high flow nasal cannulas improve the weaning process? Does it help the weaning?
Okay, Anjan, you want to take that?
Can you repeat it, Rajiv?
Does the use of HFNC make weaning easier or better?
See, what I from the question is that use of HFNC after the patient has been extubated, and then we
I
try.
think that is the question. You can't say while the question is this thing. So
Yes.
it's like you after extubation, like one uses NIV, is there a role of using HFNC as a
Yes.
means of preventing reintubation, and how frequently would you use that post extubation?
Yes, I think there is enough literature as far as non-COVID times are concerned, where after extubation patients prophylactically put on NIVs, and it has been seen that the incidence of reintubation in these group of patients is less. So there's a lot of literature on this. There is some literature on also on high flow nasal cannulas being used instead of NIVs after planned extubation as a prophylaxis, so that the reintubation rates are less. There are people who are using it. If you have enough of it, there is no harm in using it. And specific respiratory failure seen after COVID patients are likely to improve. But you must remember that HFNC has its own share of problems. We have been seeing pneumothoraxes, we have been seeing pneumomediastinums, we have been seeing surgical emphysemas. So one has to be very careful. And I would personally prefer to get a patient on an NIV mask and then take care of him after extubation, if that is the protocol in your setup. Most of the times in this pandemic times, what is happening is that high flow nasal cannulas and NIVs, not NIVs, but high flow nasal cannulas are so much in demand. We are so short of them that we hardly have anyone available to be put prophylactically for a patient who has been extubated. There is surely a place you could use it in this kind of respiratory failure, but the literature is not robust as far as HFNC is concerned.
Right, sir. So the next question now is again on managing the ventilated patient, and how important is a CT in a ventilated patient in the management? Do you need to repeat it, or does it aid in your management?
So Kapil, what is our protocol?
So we don't do repeated CTs. Actually, it doesn't help in titrating any strategy of mechanical ventilation. CT just gives an additional information, but we do repeat a lot of chest X-rays, and whatever improvement is seen on chest X-rays, we titrate our ventilator strategy based on that. CT is not needed. In fact, even in non-COVID, CT is not needed.
Okay. Now, the next question again is on mechanical ventilation, and this is about how many of your patients who are undergoing mechanical ventilations have normal lung compliance or a near normal lung compliance, and do they generally have a better prognosis than patients who have a full-blown ARDS-like picture?
Okay, I think Anjan can answer this. In the beginning of this pandemic, we were looking at two subcategories of ARDS happening as far as
Yes.
COVID was concerned, based on the low compliance and high compliance, and people had divided that into two based on also self-induced lung injury because of hyperventilation. So maybe you can just address that.
Sir, I would address it. I think just about half an hour ago or before this, me and Kapil were talking about it. Kapil, do you want to say something? If you allow it, sir.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So yes, there was a theoretical concept that patients were presenting early with high and low elastance. So there were two groups. However, these patients, most of them, they were later on developing classical ARDS only. So there's no point of giving invasive ventilation to these patients early in the course of the disease. What we realized that putting those patients early in the course of disease does not help them. So we have started delaying our intubations as much as possible. We are not intubating the patients which have preserved lung compliance or they are in the early stages of the disease. We intubate them once the classical features of ARDS developed. That means the elastance is quite high and the compliance is poor.
Correct. So I think initially the concept was that in these group of patients, you may have a different strategy and you may give a higher tidal volume because of the fact that the lung was relatively more compliant. But once you intubate them, you should be careful because many patients actually just by conscious proning, NIV and HFNO, you can get away without having to intubate them. And the strategy should be trying to do that as much as possible because as we've already discussed, once you intubate, you have so many complications that your mortality becomes much higher.
Right, sir. Yes.
Sir, obviously we have always discussed this, that if a patient had normal compliance earlier on, he would surely do better. But nowadays, with the second surge coming in, most of the times we get patients are with having a bad compliance because they've already had their share of steroids, inhaled, IV, oral before they come to us, and the patients are sicker. So compliance is become an issue now, and we hardly see patients who come on mechanical ventilation with a normal compliance.
I agree with that. There is a little change. We are seeing now patients who are more sick, patients who tend to stay at home longer, and it really come to the hospital when the lungs have really become stiff. So there is a change in the profile and maybe the change in the type of patients that we are taking in. In the early part of the pandemic, a lot of mild cases were also getting admitted and were being monitored very closely because we did not know that much. Right now, all of them are now going in for home isolation. And still we are having this huge surge as far as sick patients are concerned.
So the next one is on ultrasounds in the ICU. So what is the role of a lung ultrasound, and can measuring the extravascular lung water monitoring help in the management of these patients?
So in my mind, ultrasound, if it is available, is essential in all ICUs, but Kapil can take it up as to how useful it is.
So compared to X-ray, which we get done once in a day, ultrasound can be repeated multiple times in a day, and it does help us specifically in a fluid challenge or the fluid titrating our fluid strategy for the patient. If you extravascular lung water all over the field, we tend to limit our fluid administration. In fact, we tend to keep the lungs dry. Whereas in the patients who got classical ARDS with the skip areas and not much of a B profile, but sort of a consolidation, and the echo supporting, the heart supporting, then we can go for the fluid challenges. So it does help in fluid titration and also monitoring of the lung tissues. Just with ultrasound, where we can see whether the underlying lung condition or lung pathology is improving or not. We have just recently submitted a paper in the journal on the serial ultrasound changes in the COVID-19 patients, and it's a useful technology. Specifically, it's a point of care examination, and that's when in this COVID-19 we can't use our stethoscopes. So lung ultrasound becomes as a visual.
Along with that, you can also do a cardiac evaluation, and it's worthwhile to look at the right side of the heart, look at the rough idea of ejection fraction, what happens looking at the pulmonary artery, and getting an idea, is there a sudden increase suggesting pulmonary embolism? So it's worthwhile to look at that. It's worthwhile to look at the IVC also. So you must do a comprehensive ultrasound, and as Kapil said, it can be done repeatedly. You could also look at look for any deep vein thrombosis by doing an ultrasound of the leg also as a part of your screening ultrasound, just to see that there is any evidence of DVT also.
Yes, sir.
As rightly said by Dr. Guleria, it's ultrasound is now as good as what we had in our third year of undergraduate education, a stethoscope, right? And in an ICU, an ultrasound will, other than what all said, we'll have to take into consideration the extravascular lung water as far as ventilated patients are concerned, the IVC diameter, and then try to regulate and see whether we can extubate these patients or not, or if they'll end up into a difficult to wean kind of scenario. So ultrasounds done repeatedly will surely add to the outcomes. And this is the best time that we have been trying to teach our people. We in our ICU teams, we have people who are not really into intensive care, who are just fresh graduates in various, let's say, medicine, pulmonary medicine, or anesthesia for that matter. So an ultrasound in these kind of scenarios can be a big learning tool for all of them. And I think it should be available in all ICUs, not one, but at least a couple of them, and one at least per 10 unit bed of an ICU. And with all the 3 probes, especially an echo probe also, if that's available, so that you can do your own right heart or a cardiac evaluation.
The only challenge, if I may just say, just to be on the lighter side, is that we should have ultrasound. The problem is the PNDT Act, which is creating a lot of issues as far as getting an ultrasound in smaller hospitals is concerned. But I think the benefits far outweigh the risks that are being made out.
So another question on the ICU fluid management, that if the patient is in pulmonary edema, how do you balance fluid versus diuretics? And are the diuretic use associated with thromboembolism?
Okay, Anjan, if you want to take it, or
Yes.
Neeraj can also sort of.
No, I think Neeraj can take it first. Neeraj.
Again, keeping a patient hydrated as well as keeping patient dry, both have to play an important role. So definitely, if patient has landed up straight in ICU, you have to assess whether the patient is dehydrated or not. And of course, using ultrasound or echocardiography, one can clearly demarcate that thing. But we do use Lasix in some of our patients in whom we see that fluid overload could be a challenge, and that is actually causing the respiratory distress. So we do try Lasix infusion in select group of patients where fluid overload is thought to be the predominant challenge, apart from, of course, underlying COVID pneumonia. So it has to be basically a balance between the two because both of them can be detrimental for the patient. So depending on the situation of the patient, your clinical assessment, your lab parameters, and other assessment tools which you have to take a call whether the patient requires fluid or a Lasix infusion or both.
Okay, we've reached about the scheduled end of our time. We normally schedule about 90 minutes. So before I close, I'll ask a question which I skipped very much, which came up very early in the day. What is your take on the home ICUs? So a number of people are now setting up home ICUs if they can afford it. So what does the panel believe on home ICUs?
Let me take it first.
Sure, sir.
In the last 10 days or so, maybe after 1st of May, when the positivity rate went up to 50% or 40%, I've had about 5 calls from various people where money was never a criteria. They had promised me they can fund anything. And the only limiting thing I have told each one of them is, from where will you get your doctors and nurses? So after 12 hours, a phone came, nurses have been organized. Now, please help us also to organize doctors. We have already organized monitors, oxygen cylinders, and ventilators. I personally feel it is, people think that an ICU, home ICU is just a place where you can have oxygen monitor and oxygen cylinders and ventilators. In the pandemic, maybe that's all out of the box thinking, but one needs to have enough of total help as far as setting up of ICUs in various farmhouses, which is happening in Delhi. I'm aware of a farmhouse where they have a 5-bedded ICU for their extended family, though nobody is sick there, but they've already set it up.
Yes, so I think I'll just add on to this that this is something that we're seeing out of panic, and I would strongly discourage that. Anjan knows that just 2 days ago, I shifted a patient who in his own house had made an ICU That got nurses around the clock, was on high flow oxygen, using cylinders, a monitor, and they consulted some doctor and who said, give methylprednisolone. He gave 500 milligram methylprednisolone. The saturation was going up to the 70s. And then we had to rush an ambulance to bring them and get them admitted in the ICU. So this you keep hearing, and many people feel that because they have enough resources, they can set it up in their house and buy a ventilator, buy a oxygen cylinders, buy a monitor, but they don't realize that ICU care is much more than the equipment that you have. It is requiring a lot of other things. Just if it was only the equipment, then things would have been much more easier. So I think we need to discourage this very, very aggressively, because this can be more harmful than causing any benefit.
Right, sir. So we've come to the end of most of the questions that we had, and we also
I would just say that any comments from people in the group in terms of home ICUs? Okay.
Just very discouraged.
Right, sir. Sir, would you like to make any closing remarks before we close for today?
No, thank you very much. And I think this was one of the, in my mind, maybe the most difficult topic that we were going to discuss, and would have a lot of things as part in terms of the technical aspects. And I'm really thankful to Dr. Kapil to who has tried and simplified it as much as possible. Ventilatory management and management of ARDS can be very, very complicated when you start discussing airway dynamics and pathophysiology and things like that. But I think the simple thing here is that we need to really develop strategies of how we can get people who are not critical care specialists managing such patients in, let's say, a district hospital or a smaller town. So that should be our strategy. I'm not saying that this is how it should be done. This is not an ideal strategy. One would like to have these patients managed in a good critical care setup. But we're going through a pandemic with more than 4 lakh cases a day. I don't think we have that luxury. And therefore, we must accept that we will have to have setups where you will have physicians who are not trained in critical care to be forced to manage such patients. And that is why, like I said in the beginning, it may be worthwhile to make a simple standard SOP or flow chart of how to manage, how to intubate, what to do, what settings to do, after how many, let's say after 1 hour, monitor the saturation. If the saturation is good, decrease the FiO2, and then see how to the saturation. So a stepwise approach as to what you can do, and maintaining contact with a critical care specialist through teleconsultation, and same what should be the criteria for weaning and things like that. Maybe as a group we can try and make those simple charts, because they would be useful at a district hospital level for people to manage patients with ARDS. But I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Anjan, who has really patiently answered many questions, Dr. Neeraj, and of course, Dr. Kapil for an excellent presentation. And finally, of course, Rajiv for coordinating everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again tomorrow. Hopefully, we're going to talk about antiviral drugs and remdesivir. And that again, I anticipate a lot of questions on that. So we'll see you back on for remdesivir and antivirals tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.